Welcome to Sabbath Conversations. Please subscribe to our channel so that you'll be notified when we post new videos. Today I want to talk with us about a movie that just came out. It's entitled A Sabbath. And the premise of the movie is calling for rest. For rest because society is so burdened. Society is so engulfed with the things that are going on. And so the movie presents the whole principle of a need for rest. The movie features representatives from different denominations, various religious persuasions. There are Jewish rabbis in the movie. There are Methodist pastors. There are Roman Catholic priests. There are Seventh-day Adventist preachers. And they all are talking about this need for rest, which seems quite innocent and, yes, indeed, a very good thing. But my concern is not so much about the movie itself per se, but about this whole idea, what seems to be an accelerating, intensive call for Sunday sacredness. The movie itself does not endorse any particular day or, for that matter, any particular religion. Again, it is just appealing to the viewers to take seriously the consideration about having a rest. But here is the basis for my concern. This call for Sunday sacredness is just intensifying at a rather accelerated rate, if you will, as we look around the country here in the United States, and yes, indeed, around the world. Let me share some examples with you. Recently, the very influential Billy Graham Evangelistic Crusade, they're making the call that we should come back to rest and go to church on Sunday. We see here that Portuguese Catholics are calling for work-free Sundays so that they could go back to rest. Very popular conservative American magazine, The American Conservative, recently called for us to bring back Sunday laws. As far as Singapore, we have a Roman Catholic cardinal that is calling for mandatory Sunday rest and for taking the Eucharist. We see in Europe that a very influential Roman Catholic bishop is reiterating the call for Sunday sacredness. Another American magazine is telling us that there is a need to promote a Sunday sacredness. Again, all with the idea for rest. We see here a Methodist pastor calls for obedience to a Sunday blue laws. And of course, those are laws that are calling for mandatory closures on Sunday and so forth. We go to Colombia in South America, that the newspaper is calling for rest on Sunday. We could go to Australia, and Australia wants people to remember, and there's even speaking about America reinstituting Sunday blue laws. In Israel, of all places, we have a prominent rabbi is advocating for Sunday rest in Israel so that it could heal the cultural divide. Texas newspaper columnist is calling for rest and worship on Sunday. We see here that this whole call for Sunday rest, one newspaper writes, it's an integral part of the climate change agenda. And that's where my major concern comes in. You see, we could rest on any day. You could rest on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, whatever day you want to rest. But what is happening here is a push for rest to be on Sunday, Sunday's sacredness, which they all are mistakenly calling a Sabbath, I guess, of course, with the exception of the Seventh-day Adventist pastor that was in the movie. A Seventh-day Adventist, we believe that God has already given us a day of rest from creation. When you look at the creation narrative, God created the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that in them in 6 days. And then on the seventh day, the Bible tells us, on the seventh day, God rested from all the work which he had made. And God blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. He sanctified the seventh day Sabbath. And then we find that Moses, God's prophet, he writes to us in the book of Exodus, where God came down and gave his people, the Israelites at that time, his 10 commandments. And by the way, the 10 commandments, even though they were given to the Israelites, it was not given for the Israelites only, but it was given for all humanity, because that's why the Israelite nation was raised up. The Bible tells us in the book of Isaiah chapter 56 and verse 9, that God had called them and given him his oracles, his plan of salvation to share to the rest of the world. And the Sabbath, as part of his commandments, were part of that. And so we find in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, the Bible reads, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth and the sea and fountain of waters, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." And so we see here that based on the Bible, the Sabbath day, the day of rest and worship, is the seventh day of the week. And yes, in Israel, that is what is recognized, in organizations like the Seventh-day Adventist Church preach and teach that the seventh day is the Sabbath day. It's a day not only of rest, but it's a day of worship to remember our Creator. That's the most important a reason for the Sabbath. Yes, rest is part of it. But as I said earlier, you could rest any day of the week, whether you be religious or non-religious. You could choose any day of the week to rest. But when it comes to the Sabbath day, the day that the Bible gives us is the seventh day Sabbath, today we call Saturday. And so with respect to this movie and the other calls that are going around the world, as a matter of fact, the calls that are going out, if you will, for this call for specifically Sunday sacredness, it should be of concern to you, a child of God. Why, should you ask? Well, most of these organizations, they claim that because Jesus has risen on the first day of the week, therefore Sunday should be kept holy. Of course, you can't find any evidence of that whatsoever in the Bible. You could go from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single verse in Scripture which says that you should keep Sunday holy, because Jesus was resurrected from the grave on Sunday. That is basically a tradition of men that has come down to the Christian churches through the Roman Catholic papacy, which, by the way, admits that you can't find it in the Bible, and that's a tradition of the Roman Church. My dear brothers and sisters, the main reason for me to be bringing this to your attention is that the Bible predicts that as we come to the closing scenes of Earth's history, there would be a tremendous struggle between the keeping of the seventh-day Sabbath and Sunday sacredness. And I want to say to us today that this is exactly what is happening, and that conflict is going to intensify, because the Bible tells us that those that are promoting a Sunday would one day institute it by law across the entire globe. And those that don't keep Sunday would be persecuted, would be maligned. And yes, as the Bible tells us in the book of Revelation, the 13th chapter, in which the Bible calls Sunday sacredness the mark of the beast, that beast referring to none other than the papal power. And she says herself that Sunday is the mark of our authority. The church is above the Bible. Therefore, we have changed the seventh-day Sabbath to Sunday. My dear brothers and sisters, this is the situation in which we are faced as we come down to the closing scenes of Earth's history. Each of us would have to make a decision. Are you going to obey God, the God of creation, which has given us the seventh-day Sabbath from the time of creation? The prophets, they taught it. The prophets called God's people to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Jesus lived the Sabbath. The early church kept the Sabbath according to the commandments of God and the example that Jesus had left for them. The Bible tells us clearly that when the earth is made new, that God's people would come from one Sabbath to the other to worship the Lord thy God. I want you to know that even though this call is going out to keep Sunday holy and sacred, and by the way, only God could make a day holy. No human instrument could make a day holy, and the day that he has made holy, it's the seventh-day Sabbath. And even as this call is going out, that we're seeing in the media, and I've just shared a little taste of it, even though we see this movie, and again, I want to be very fair that the movie does not in any way specify Sunday or the seventh-day Sabbath. It simply calls for this day of rest. But nevertheless, it falls into that mixture of calling for Sunday sacredness, because most of the individuals in the movie are people that are promoting Sunday sacredness and mistakenly called it Sabbath. The Sabbath is the seventh day. It can't be the first day of the week and the seventh day also. And so there is a lot of confusion in this whole call for Sunday as the Sabbath and to keep it holy. My dear brothers and sisters, each of you that are within the sound of my voice has an opportunity to make a choice. You either obey God, which says, remember his Sabbath day to keep it holy, the seventh-day Sabbath, or you follow the tradition of men, specifically the tradition of the Roman Church that is calling men and women to keep Sunday. And yes, as one of these publications pointed out, it's part of the climate change agenda, where men and women are being told that if they would come back to keeping Sunday holy, it would mitigate the climate change crisis. Now, I want you to know that that will never happen, because the Bible predicts that this earth. We are experiencing the things that we are experiencing not because of lack of keeping Sunday sacred rather, but it's because that we have broken God's law. It is because of sin that we are experiencing the problems that we are experiencing in this world, including the problem of the climate change crisis, and it is a real crisis. My dear brothers and sisters, the Bible tells us that even as this call is going out for Sunday sacredness, God is calling men and women back to honor him by keeping his seventh-day Sabbath. We find in the book of Revelation, chapter 14, that it is very clear. John writes, I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel. What is the everlasting gospel? Salvation by God's grace through faith in his Son and our Savior Jesus Christ, saying with a loud voice, the verse continued, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. Very clearly, the Bible is telling us, taking our minds back to the God of creation, and we ought to worship him. And how do we worship him? By keeping his seventh-day Sabbath, which is part of his commandments. The choice is yours, my dear brothers and sisters. And yes, in a very positive way, I think that this movie this movie would be calling for a day of rest. But as you look at the movie, as you listen to these commentators, as you read the articles, remember that the Sabbath day is the seventh day of the week, and that God says that there would be a conflict. Which side of the conflict will you be on? God is calling for a people today to represent him by keeping all of his commandments, including his seventh-day Sabbath. The choice is yours. I invite you, my dear brothers and sisters, to visit our website at thesabbathtruth.org. And there you'll find much more information on this issue with regards to Sabbath versus Sunday. And you could make an intelligent decision as you get that information. Again, subscribe to our channel so that you'll be notified when we post other videos. And in the meantime, remember that God says, these men honored me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. By trying to keep Sunday sacred, men are basically honoring God with their lips and setting aside the commandments of God. I pray that someone was edified by this message and that you would be able to make a decision to choose what God requires of you is to keep his seventh-day Sabbath. Until we meet again, I invite you to subscribe to our channel so that you'll be able to get the additional videos as we post them with regards to this ongoing conflict between Sabbath, God's seventh-day Sabbath, and Sunday sacredness. God bless you until we meet again in Sabbath Conversations.